October 1944, Moscow. Behind the heavy doors of Stalin's Kremlin office, Winston Churchill unfolds a small blue slip of paper. On it, 5 countries and a series of percentages. Romania, 90% Soviet influence. Greece, 90% British. Yugoslavia, 50-50. It takes less than a minute. Stalin nods, draws a blue check mark, and hands it back. That moment, a quiet exchange of ink and silence, would redraw half of Europe. What followed was not written in treaties, but in blood, betrayal, and uneasy alliance. Fact 1. The paper that divided Europe. The meeting in Moscow in October 1944 was meant to be diplomatic, but it quickly became something else, an informal carving of a continent. Churchill, weary and desperate to contain Soviet expansion, proposed what he called a naughty document. He took a half sheet of paper and wrote down the future of Eastern Europe in cold percentages. Romania, 90% Soviet influence. Greece, 90% British. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet. Hungary and Yugoslavia evenly split. Then he slid it across Stalin's desk. There was a pause. Stalin read it, reached for his blue pencil, and made a small check mark beside it, as if approving an order for supplies. No record of protest, no ideological debate. Just 2 men, exhausted by war, deciding the fate of millions with numbers. To Churchill, it was pragmatic diplomacy. To Stalin, it was opportunity. Britain had conceded Eastern Europe before the war was even over. The deal was never formalized, but its shadow outlived both men. When British diplomats later questioned the morality of it, Churchill brushed it aside. "Might it not be thought rather cynical?" he wrote in his memoirs. "Let us burn the paper." But history didn't burn. Romania fell into Soviet hands, its king forced to abdicate. Bulgaria turned red within months. Hungary followed after a brief, bloody struggle. Greece, the lone exception, plunged into civil war as Churchill tried to defend his share of the bargain. That one sheet of paper, signed by nothing but a pencil mark, became a prophecy of the Iron Curtain. The Percentages Agreement, as historians later called it, was not a treaty of peace. It was a quiet acknowledgement of how power truly worked in 1944, through exhaustion, calculation, and fear. For the soldiers still dying on the front lines, the war seemed to be fought for freedom. But inside that room in Moscow, freedom was already being divided, 1 percentage at a time. Fact 2. The train of vodka and secrets. In late October 1942, a British military train rolled eastward through the icy emptiness of the Soviet steppe. On board were crates of whiskey, tins of sardines, and an exhausted delegation of British officers carrying messages from Churchill himself. They were traveling toward Moscow to keep Stalin in the war, to remind him that Britain still stood, and that an invasion of France would come, soon. But it wasn't just food and fuel they carried. Hidden among the crates were coded documents, military blueprints, and private letters between the 2 leaders. Letters that revealed a strange intimacy between enemies of ideology. 2 men who distrusted each other, yet needed each other to survive. When the train finally arrived, Soviet soldiers stood at attention, rifles slung, faces unreadable. The British delegation was led to the Kremlin through streets darkened by blackout curtains. Churchill's letter was handed to Stalin in person. It promised unflinching solidarity, spoke of future offensives, and offered shipments of Spitfire aircraft and radar equipment in exchange for Soviet pressure on the Eastern Front. Stalin read it slowly, then poured vodka. That night, in the dimly lit Kremlin dining room, the 2 delegations drank together for the first time. Stalin, usually cold and expressionless, began to laugh. He toasted to the British Lion, wounded but not dead. He asked questions about London during the Blitz, about the bombings, about Churchill's family. It was, by all accounts, one of the rare moments of warmth between them. But beneath the toasts, each side was measuring the other. The British suspected that Stalin was negotiating behind their backs with the Germans through neutral Sweden. Stalin, in turn, believed that Churchill was delaying the Second Front to let the Red Army bleed. Every glass raised that night was a test. Every smile masked suspicion. As dawn approached, the vodka ran out, and the British officers were escorted back to their quarters. In his diary, one wrote, "We came to build trust and left with frost in our bones." Yet something essential had changed. The meeting proved to Stalin that Churchill was willing to bend, to flatter, even to drink to his health, all to keep the alliance alive. That train, packed with whiskey, supplies, and coded diplomacy, was more than a mission of goodwill. It was the beginning of a dangerous courtship between two men who would never truly trust each other, yet would secretly agree on how the modern world would be divided. Each understood the other's cynicism, and both knew that without deceit, there could be no victory. Fact 3. The gift of the secret. List. In May 1943, as London still trembled under the echoes of bomb raids, a diplomatic courier left Downing Street with a sealed envelope marked "Personal for Marshal Stalin." Inside was not a letter of friendship, but a list, precise, cold, and dangerous. It contained the names of dozens of Soviet officers captured in Poland and held by the Germans, many of whom had vanished without trace. The list had come through the British intelligence network in Switzerland, along with reports of mass graves discovered near a place called Katyn. Churchill faced a decision that no ally should have to make, whether to confront Stalin with the truth or to bury it for the sake of the war. By the spring of 1943, the German propaganda machine was already accusing the Soviets of murdering thousands of Polish officers in the Katyn forest. The evidence pointed unmistakably toward the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Churchill knew it. British intelligence knew it. Even Roosevelt's advisors suspected it, yet to admit it publicly would tear the fragile alliance apart. When the courier arrived in Moscow, Stalin's officials received him with courtesy and silence. The envelope was taken directly to Stalin's desk. He read it, said nothing, and then smiled faintly. "German lies," he muttered, and placed the paper aside. The conversation that followed between him and the British ambassador, Sir Archibald Clark Kerr, was brief, almost polite. Stalin insisted that the Germans had forged everything. Kerr nodded, pretending to believe him. Both men knew it was an act. That quiet exchange became one of the darkest unspoken agreements of the war. London would not press the matter. Moscow would not be humiliated. The truth of Katyn would be locked away for half a century. Churchill later confided in his private secretary, "There are times when truth is so precious, it must be guarded by a bodyguard of lies." And so, for the sake of unity against Hitler, Britain chose silence. Tens of thousands of Polish families never learned what happened to their fathers, brothers, and sons until decades later, when the Soviet archives finally opened. But in 1943, the truth was sacrificed to diplomacy. That single act, the quiet decision to look away, revealed how far the pact between Churchill and Stalin had gone beyond necessity. It was no longer about trust, but about survival. Two leaders bound not by ideals, but by the belief that the end justified the means. And in the dim corridors of wartime London, the list was filed away. Another secret swallowed by victory. Fact 4. The Dinner of Shadows, in Tehran. On the evening of November 28, 1943, in a heavily guarded villa in Tehran, Joseph Stalin poured himself another glass of Georgian wine and watched Churchill across the table. Franklin Roosevelt, exhausted from travel, sat between them, the third man in an uneasy trinity. The Tehran Conference, their first face-to-face meeting, was meant to confirm unity among the Allies. Instead, it exposed the quiet, ruthless calculations beneath their smiles. The dinner began with polite toasts, to victory, to friendship, to the destruction of Nazi Germany. But as the night deepened, the conversation turned darker. Stalin, half amused, half provocative, leaned forward and said through his interpreter, "We should execute 50,000 German officers after the war." Roosevelt laughed softly, thinking it was a joke. Churchill did not. His face tightened. He slammed his hand on the table and barked, "No, such barbarity is not British." The room fell silent. Stalin stared at him with cold curiosity, then chuckled. Perhaps 49,000 then. Roosevelt smiled again, but Churchill didn't. He reached for his cigar, breathing hard, his anger visible. Moments later, Stalin offered another toast to the true unity of nations. The tension dissolved into forced laughter, but the message had been delivered. Stalin was testing him, measuring how far the British Prime Minister would go in moral compromise. Later that night, Churchill and Stalin met privately, without Roosevelt. It was here that the true understanding began to form, an unrecorded conversation between two men who both distrusted the Americans. Churchill offered support for Stalin's western borders after the war, quietly acknowledging Soviet control over eastern Poland in exchange for cooperation on the planned invasion of France. Stalin, in return, promised to launch a massive offensive on the Eastern Front to keep German divisions occupied. It was diplomacy built on exhaustion and cynicism. Churchill left the meeting convinced he had outmaneuvered Stalin. Stalin left amused at how much Britain was willing to concede. When the conference ended, a photographer captured the three leaders standing side by side, smiling, confident, and united. Behind those smiles lay the real story. Churchill had begun to trade moral ground for strategic advantage, while Stalin had confirmed that the West would tolerate his future empire in Eastern Europe. That dinner in Tehran wasn't just a diplomatic meal. It was a rehearsal for the post-war order, one where laughter disguised threats, and victory was already being divided among the victors. In that candlelit room, over wine and forced laughter, the foundations of the Cold War were quietly laid. Fact 5. The telegram that saved Stalin's patience. By the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union was bleeding. The German advance toward Stalingrad seemed unstoppable, and Stalin's messages to London grew colder, sharper, and more desperate. "Open a second front," he demanded, "or we shall fall." The British cabinet hesitated. Their armies were stretched thin across North Africa, and their skies still bore the scars of the Blitz. But Churchill knew, if Stalin lost faith, the alliance could collapse overnight. So, on August 23, 1942, Churchill sent one of the most delicate telegrams of his career. Written in his own hand, it began not with military promises, but with words of empathy. "I understand the great suffering of your people. I assure you that we are doing everything possible to ease your burden." Behind those words, however, was calculation. Churchill couldn't give Stalin what he wanted, not yet, but he could give him something more valuable: belief that Britain still cared. The message was followed by a secret delivery. British intelligence, acting on Churchill's order, sent Soviet envoys precise details of the upcoming Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, information so sensitive that even many generals in London didn't have it. Stalin read the report personally. Though it wasn't the second front he wanted in France, it was proof that the West was finally moving. He calmed, slightly. A few days later, a Soviet cable arrived at Downing Street. Its tone was unexpectedly warm. "I appreciate your frankness. The Red Army continues its task with renewed determination." Stalin's words were rare, almost human. Churchill showed the message to his advisors and said quietly, "We have bought time, gentlemen." But time in war always came at a cost. To sustain that fragile trust, Churchill agreed to expand Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union, authorizing massive convoys across the Arctic. Men and ships were lost in freezing seas. The crews called them suicide runs. Yet those ships carried tanks, ammunition, aircraft, even food, the bloodline of the alliance. Each shipment was both a gift and a gamble. The British public never knew that Churchill continued the Arctic convoys even when intelligence warned they'd be slaughtered by German submarines. "Better to lose steel than lose Stalin?" he once remarked grimly. The telegram that saved Stalin's patience was more than an act of diplomacy. It was the price of survival, a message that bought another winter of cooperation between men who neither trusted nor forgave each other. It showed how a few words, sent across thousands of miles of radio static, could hold together an alliance built on necessity, not faith. And for a brief moment, amidst suspicion and loss, the illusion of unity held. Fact 6. The Pact of Silence over Poland. By early 1945, victory was within reach. Yet beneath the triumphal speeches and handshakes, one word poisoned every Allied conversation: Poland. It was the country whose invasion had begun the war, and now it stood to be divided by those who promised to liberate it. Churchill called it the soul of Europe. Stalin called it a corridor of security. And somewhere between those phrases, Poland vanished. In February 1945, at Yalta, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to decide Europe's future. The conference hall, a faded palace in Crimea, smelled of cigar smoke, wet uniforms, and fatigue. The war had broken all of them. Roosevelt, pale and ill, sought compromise. Churchill still hoped to keep British influence in Central Europe. Stalin wanted the Red Army's conquests to become permanent borders. The discussions were civil, but the truth was brutal. Whoever occupied a land by war would own it in peace. Polish representatives begged London to defend their independence. They had fought alongside the British since 1939. They had died in the skies over England. Yet Churchill knew that the Red Army was already standing in Warsaw. "We cannot fight our ally," he told his staff. His voice was low, almost ashamed. So, at Yalta, a quiet understanding was reached. Stalin promised free elections in Poland, a phrase everyone in the room knew was a lie. Churchill and Roosevelt accepted it anyway, clinging to the illusion that post-war cooperation was still possible. In his private notes, Churchill later wrote, "It was a tragedy to watch the cause for which we entered the war being betrayed before our eyes." But he also knew there was no alternative. The West could not face another war, not against the Red Army. After the conference, Stalin moved swiftly. Soviet-backed authorities seized power in Warsaw. The Polish government in exile in London was ignored, its leaders branded as fascist remnants. Churchill protested through diplomatic cables, but his words carried no weight. The agreement he had signed at Yalta, the one he thought would protect Poland, became the very paper that buried its freedom. Years later, British veterans who had fought for a free Poland would watch as the Iron Curtain descended across the map, and they would ask what it had all been for. The Pact of Silence over Poland was not written in ink, but in exhaustion and fear. It marked the moment when Churchill's alliance with Stalin crossed from necessity into moral defeat. For Stalin, it was the completion of his vision. Eastern Europe as a shield of red. For Churchill, it was the bitter realization that victory had come at the cost of everything Britain claimed to defend. Fact 7. The night Churchill saw the future in Moscow. In August 1942, long before Yalta and before trust had fully decayed, Winston Churchill boarded a British bomber bound for Moscow. The flight took him over dark seas, enemy skies, and fire-lit horizons, all to meet the man whose friendship terrified him most. He carried gifts, reports, and a personal letter from King George VI. But what he wanted was something far rarer, a glimpse into Stalin's mind. The city was nearly silent when he arrived. Moscow was a fortress, windows blacked out, air raid sirens muted by exhaustion. Stalin greeted him in the Kremlin past midnight, wearing his field tunic, his expression unreadable. Churchill, ever theatrical, began with compliments and flattery, hoping to melt the Soviet granite. He spoke of shared sacrifice, of brotherhood in arms, and of Britain's admiration for the Red Army's endurance. Stalin listened, smoking slowly. The conversation soon turned cold. Stalin accused Britain of cowardice, of letting the Soviets bleed alone while the West delayed the Second Front. "You are afraid of the Germans," he said bluntly through his interpreter. Churchill bristled. "If you knew how we've suffered," he snapped back, "you would not speak so lightly." The room went silent. Then something unexpected happened. Stalin poured vodka, raised his glass, and said, "Let us drink to courage, yours and mine." Churchill, startled, accepted. The tension broke. They drank, then talked for hours, about Hitler's psychology, about military supply routes, about the future of Europe. Batiyaku, Dawn, the two men, so different in spirit, had found a strange kind of understanding. Not friendship, but recognition. That night, Churchill saw something that chilled him more than Stalin's threats: his vision. The Soviet leader spoke calmly about the necessity of friendly governments along Russia's borders, Poland, Romania, Hungary. He said they would be independent but safe for socialism. Churchill understood instantly what that meant: the redrawing of Europe under Soviet control. The war was still raging, but Stalin was already thinking about the peace. In his notes from that visit, Churchill later wrote, "I felt I was looking into the future, and it was dark indeed." Yet he left Moscow reassured, at least publicly. He called Stalin a man of massive courage and described their meeting as a success. Privately, he knew the truth. He had seen the shape of post-war Europe, and it was painted in the colors of fear and compromise. That August night, in the smoky rooms of the Kremlin, two men, one imperial, one revolutionary, stood together at the edge of history. Churchill left believing he had preserved an alliance. Stalin knew he had secured a continent. Fact 8. The bargain over the Balkans. Autumn 1944. The war's end was visible on the horizon, but the peace was already being divided. As German forces retreated from the Balkans, a dangerous vacuum opened, a crossroads between East and West that could determine the balance of Europe for generations. In that void, Churchill and Stalin made one of the most cynical arrangements of the entire war, a quiet deal that traded nations like coins on a table. The British called it the Balkan Understanding. Stalin called it practical necessity. History remembers it as the Percentages Agreement. It began with a simple question: who would control the Balkans when the Germans were gone? Yugoslavia was in chaos, Greece was on fire with civil war, and Romania and Bulgaria were already crawling with Soviet troops. Churchill feared that if the Red Army occupied everything south of the Danube, the Mediterranean would become a Soviet lake. On October 9, 1944, in Moscow, Churchill arrived at Stalin's office with a small entourage. The air outside still smelled of burning oil from the war. Inside, the two leaders sat at a polished wooden table under a portrait of Lenin. Churchill, cigar in hand, began with his usual charm. "Let us settle our affairs in the Balkans," he said. Stalin leaned forward. "How do you propose to settle them?" Churchill took out a piece of paper and began writing. "Romania, Russia 90%, others 10%. Greece, Britain 90%, Russia 10%. Yugoslavia 50-50. Hungary 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia 75%, others 25%. Then, in a gesture that would echo through history, he slid the slip across the table. Stalin read it silently, reached for his blue pencil, and drew a single check mark beside it. That was it. Oh, continent was divided in less than 5 minutes. Afterward, Churchill recalled that they both looked at each other and laughed, uneasily, as if aware of the moral abyss beneath the joke. "Might it not be thought rather cynical?" he later wrote in his memoirs. Stalin shrugged. "Let it stay between us," he said. Within weeks, Soviet troops cemented control over Romania and Bulgaria. British forces landed in Greece, crushing the communist uprising in Athens. The map that Churchill and Stalin had drawn by hand became prophecy. Yugoslavia and Hungary balanced uneasily between the two powers, the gray zones of the coming Cold War. It was not a treaty, not a document with seals or signatures, just one piece of paper folded into Churchill's pocket and never officially acknowledged. But its consequences were irreversible. The Iron Curtain, long before it had a name, was already descending, not by war, but by agreement. In that smoky Kremlin office, two weary victors decided the fate of millions without consultation or consent. To the world, they remained allies against tyranny. But in that room, amid pencil marks and cigarette smoke, they revealed the truth. The line between victory and betrayal was measured not in ideals, but in percentages. Fact 9. The Promise Beneath the Black Sea. February 1945. The Crimean air was thick with salt and smoke as the world's three most powerful men met at Yalta. The palace, once a royal retreat, had been turned into a fortress of diplomacy, its marble halls now echoing with translators' whispers and the shuffle of soldiers standing guard outside. Churchill arrived exhausted, his eyes dark from sleepless nights and unspoken doubts. Stalin was calm, unreadable, a man already living in the post-war world, and Roosevelt, frail and pale, sat between them, the dying center of a fragile triangle. The meetings were supposed to decide how to finish the war. Instead, they decided how to divide its spoils. Poland, Germany, the Balkans, even the fate of Asia, everything was on the table. But one of the most secret and consequential agreements reached there wasn't written in the final communiques. It was a conversation between Churchill and Stalin that took place during a late-night walk near the Black Sea, when the official sessions had ended and the interpreters followed at a discreet distance. Churchill, bundled in his overcoat, tried one last time to defend Europe's independence. He spoke of the future, of freedom, of the need for a balanced peace. Stalin stopped, looked out over the dark water, and replied in a low voice, "There is no balance without security, and for Russia, security begins where the Red Army stands." It was not a threat, it was a fact. In that moment, Churchill understood that no treaty, no promise, no rhetoric could move Stalin's armies once they occupied a country. So he shifted his strategy. He offered something different: silence. If Stalin would allow British dominance in Greece and respect the fragile Mediterranean routes, Churchill would no longer contest Soviet influence in Romania and Bulgaria. Stalin nodded. "Let each keep his own house in order," he said. The next day, the conference resumed, as if nothing had happened. Publicly, they spoke of unity and cooperation. Privately, they had already sealed Europe's division, confirmed not by signatures, but by acceptance. Churchill later called Yalta the most terrible defeat for the West dressed up as victory. He knew the truth. Britain had traded moral ground for survival. When the leaders left Crimea, the sea was calm, but the world was already splitting. Soviet troops tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. British ships patrolled the Mediterranean, guarding routes that no longer mattered. The promise made beneath the Black Sea, unspoken, unofficial, but understood, became the quiet birth of the Cold War. It was not a declaration. It was a sigh, a weary handshake in the night. And from it grew 4 decades of suspicion, walls, and wire fences, all rooted in that moment when 2 men agreed that peace could not be shared, only managed. Fact 10. The secret train to Potsdam, July 1945. The war in Europe was over, but peace had not yet begun. Across the smoking ruins of Germany, a special train left Moscow bound for Berlin, its windows blacked out, its passengers handpicked by the Kremlin. On board were Stalin's translators, bodyguards, and a small iron chest containing documents marked "Personal Correspondence, London." They were letters from Winston Churchill, the last he would ever write to Stalin as Prime Minister. By the time the train reached Potsdam, everything had changed. Roosevelt was dead. Churchill was fighting for re-election, and the world they had built together was already cracking. Yet, for the cameras, they smiled. In the Sicilienhof Palace, draped with Soviet flags, Churchill met Stalin for what would be the final time. The air was thick with heat and quiet distrust. Stalin congratulated him on victory in Europe. Churchill thanked him for standing firm against tyranny. Beneath the polite phrases, both men knew the friendship had ended. The Red Army now occupied half the continent. British troops were withdrawing from Greece and Italy, broke and exhausted. In one of their last private meetings, Churchill tried to speak openly. He warned Stalin that Europe would not accept a new domination from the East. Stalin listened, expressionless, then said softly, "The Red Army does not occupy, it liberates." Churchill's reply was almost a whisper. "All conquerors say that." There was a long silence. Then Stalin smiled faintly and lit a cigarette. Outside, new leaders arrived. American generals carrying the blueprint for an untested weapon, the atomic bomb. The ground beneath their feet was shifting faster than either man could control. Churchill's power was slipping. Within days, election results in London would replace him with Clement Attlee. When the news reached the conference, Stalin raised a glass. "New times," he said. "New partners." As Churchill prepared to leave Potsdam, his car passed through streets filled with Soviet banners and British tanks. He later wrote, "I felt as if an iron curtain had fallen across the continent. It was not rhetoric, it was revelation." He had helped draw the lines that now imprisoned half of Europe. The train that had carried Stalin to Potsdam returned to Moscow loaded with documents, maps, and trophies of victory. The one carrying Churchill went home empty, except for his notes, reflections on how easily allies could become rivals, and how power, once divided, never returns. That final meeting was not an end, but a transformation. The alliance that had defeated Hitler dissolved into silence and suspicion. Churchill departed with history already turning its page, knowing that the partnership he had built through vodka, telegrams, and lies had birthed something colder, a peace as fragile as the paper on which it was written. Fact 11. The Dead Letter of Betrayal. It was March 1945, and in the gray corridors of Downing Street, Churchill dictated a message he never sent. The paper still exists, a draft letter to Joseph Stalin, full of anger, disappointment, and resignation. Its tone is not diplomatic, it is almost personal. "I trusted you," it begins, "as a comrade in arms, but you have drawn the curtain down too soon." At that moment, reports were arriving from Poland, Hungary, and Romania, all telling the same story. Soviet troops had liberated those countries from the Germans, only to replace their uniforms with another kind of rule. The so-called coalition governments promised at Yalta were collapsing one by one. Opposition leaders disappeared in the night. British diplomats were expelled or silenced, and Churchill, who had once toasted Stalin as an ally, now realized that the very armies he had helped sustain were turning Europe red. His advisors begged restraint. Britain was exhausted, its empire fracturing, its people hungry. To challenge Stalin now would mean a confrontation Britain could not win. So the letter remained on his desk, unsent, a monument to the limits of courage after too much war. But privately, Churchill could not contain his fury. In one cabinet meeting, he exploded, "We fought the wrong pig!" His words, bitter and unguarded, shocked his ministers. He had spent years balancing diplomacy and deception, writing careful words to a man he both feared and admired. Now he understood that every concession, from the percentages agreement to Yalta, had been interpreted by Stalin not as compromise, but as surrender. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin received British complaints with calm amusement. "The British are tired," he told Molotov. "They speak of friendship but think like merchants." For him, the war was already over, and the spoils were his to shape. Churchill's unsent letter remained a confession of defeat disguised as civility. "I had hoped," it read in its final lines, "that our partnership would lead to a just peace for all peoples. Instead, a shadow has fallen between us, deep and cold." Within weeks, he was no longer prime minister. But that draft, found decades later among his personal papers, revealed the truth behind the public speeches. The friendship between Churchill and Stalin had never been built on trust, only on necessity. Once that necessity ended, so did the illusion. The dead letter marked the quiet burial of an alliance that had once saved the world. It was never mailed, because Churchill already knew what the reply would be. Silence. And in that silence began the Cold War. Fact 12. The Curtain That Wouldn't Lift. March 1946. The war was over. but the peace was hollow. Winston Churchill, now out of office and weary yet restless, stood on a small stage in Fulton, Missouri. The air smelled of spring rain and cigarette smoke. Behind him, American flags fluttered in the wind. Before him sat an audience that expected gratitude, optimism, and victory. Instead, they heard a warning. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he said slowly, his voice deep and deliberate, "an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The words fell like stone. For a moment, there was silence, then a faint rustle, a cough, disbelief. No one wanted to hear that the alliance which had defeated Hitler was already dead. But Churchill was not speaking to comfort. He was confessing. The speech was not a prophecy. It was an admission that he had helped build that curtain, piece by piece, with every concession and every secret pact made with Stalin. Behind those phrases lay the memory of every room he had sat in with the Soviet leader. The dim light of the Kremlin, the smell of tobacco and fear, the half-smile of a man who never forgot a promise or a weakness. Churchill had once called Stalin the great ally, the friend of Britain, even the guardian of victory. Now he spoke his name only as a warning. He knew what the world didn't want to admit. The Red Army had not liberated Eastern Europe, it had occupied it. The governments he had helped negotiate into existence had vanished under Soviet control. The lines he had once drawn with a blue pencil on a scrap of paper were now borders patrolled by tanks. After the speech, President Truman clapped politely, but said nothing. American newspapers accused Churchill of stirring panic. In Moscow, Stalin replied coldly, calling his former ally a warmonger. Yet, within months, the world would recognize the truth in those words. The alliances hardened. Propaganda replaced diplomacy. Europe split into two realities, one capitalist, one communist, both haunted by the ghost of that wartime friendship. Churchill later told an aide, "We thought we were shaping peace, but peace shaped us." The Iron Curtain was not a sudden creation. It was the final consequence of a long chain of quiet understandings, sealed with vodka, telegrams, and weary handshakes. When Churchill named it, he was not condemning Stalin. He was at last admitting his own part in it. And as the applause faded in that Missouri auditorium, he stood still for a moment, eyes distant, as if watching the world divide once more. A world he had helped save, and also, in some tragic way, helped break. Fact 13. The interpreter, who knew too much, he was always there, quiet, invisible, seated a few feet behind Churchill and Stalin as they spoke through clouds of smoke and layers of mistrust. His name was Valentin Bereshkov, Stalin's personal interpreter. A man of impeccable memory and perfect English, he was the voice through which two of the most powerful men in history understood, and often misunderstood, each other. Bereshkov's job was to translate words, but what he truly conveyed were worlds. He saw what few others did, that every gesture, every pause, every cigar puff carried a meaning deeper than the phrases he repeated. When Churchill flattered Stalin with grand language about the noble Russian people, Bereshkov noticed Stalin's fingers tapping the table, a signal of boredom. When Stalin joked about executing 50,000 German officers, he saw Churchill's face turn gray and his hand tremble slightly on his glass. He translated the laughter, but not the silence that followed. After the war, Bereshkov recalled how often the two leaders spoke past each other, how meaning was lost between translation and suspicion. "They did not truly hear each other," he wrote. "They only waited for the other to finish." He remembered one night in October 1944, after the percentages agreement, when Stalin lingered alone with him after Churchill left. "He is a clever man," Stalin said, "but he talks too much. We shall see who owns these lands when the soldiers are gone." Years later, in London, Bereshkov's counterpart, Sir Alexander Cadogan, the British diplomat who sat behind Churchill, wrote almost the same thing. "Stalin listens like a stone. You think you are negotiating, but you are not. You are being measured." The interpreters, invisible to history, witnessed the moments when alliance turned into calculation. They carried the weight of secrets they could never speak. Berezhkov once confided that during the Tehran conference, Stalin had asked him to translate a message to Churchill word for word. The Red Army will not be lectured on freedom by empires. He hesitated, then softened it slightly in translation, changing lectured to instructed. It was a single word that saved a meeting from collapse. These men of language stood between war and misunderstanding. Without them, there might have been no alliance at all. But even they couldn't translate what lay beneath, the mistrust that no phrase could disguise. Decades later, when asked if he thought Churchill and Stalin had ever truly understood each other, Berezhkov answered quietly, "Oh, they understood each other perfectly. That was the problem." In that answer lies the truth of all their hidden pacts, that every agreement between them was never about friendship, but about endurance. The interpreters merely gave it words. The silence between those words was where the real history lived. Fact 14. The map that lied. In the winter of 1944, as the Allies advanced through Europe, a new map began to circulate through the corridors of power in London. It was printed on delicate tracing paper, marked with thin red and blue lines, and stamped, "For the Prime Minister's eyes only." Churchill kept it folded inside his briefcase, pulling it out late at night to study by the glow of a single desk lamp. To most of his staff, it looked like an ordinary map of Eastern Europe. But those who knew better called it what it truly was, the map that lied. Each line represented a promise. The blue lines, British influence; the red, Soviet. Between them, faint pencil borders traced the future. Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Greece, all divided according to the infamous percentages agreement. On paper, it looked balanced, almost fair. In reality, it was a fiction. The red zones were already crawling with the Red Army. The blue ones Britain could barely afford to defend. In February 1945, on his way to Yalta, Churchill carried that map with him. During one session, he unfolded it before Stalin, tracing with his cigar the boundary between Western and Soviet influence. "This," he said, "is how peace might look." Stalin leaned over, squinting, and smiled faintly. "Peace," he replied, "always looks good on paper." What Churchill didn't know was that Soviet intelligence already had its own version of the map, one that stretched the red zones much farther west. Soviet planners were already moving troops into Hungary and Czechoslovakia, countries that Churchill's map had marked as shared. The British version, neat and hopeful, was obsolete before the ink dried. When Churchill returned to London, he told his cabinet that the balance in Europe had been honorably settled. In truth, the paper in his briefcase was a relic of a deal that Stalin had already rewritten with tanks. The illusion of partnership remained for the sake of appearances. But the map told the real story. The West had drawn lines it could not defend. After the war, that same map was found among Churchill's personal papers, creased, stained, and slightly torn at the edges. Historians studying it decades later noted how the ink from the Soviet red zones had bled faintly into the blue, as if, even on the page, the East was devouring the West. The map that lied was not an act of deceit against Stalin. It was a lie Churchill told himself. A fragile belief that influence could exist without control, that promises could outlast armies. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest falsehoods of war are not propaganda, but the maps drawn by those who need to believe they still matter. Fact 15. The photograph they never took. In May 1945, the world celebrated. Flags waved, bells rang, and streets from London to Moscow erupted in parades of victory. But for Churchill and Stalin, there was no shared photograph, no final handshake, no triumphant image of the two men who had survived the storm together. History would never record them side by side in peace. The alliance that had saved Europe ended in silence, without ceremony, without warmth, without goodbye. In those last days of the war, their messages grew colder. Churchill sent a telegram of congratulations, formal and restrained. Stalin replied briefly, thanking him for Britain's contribution to the victory over fascism. There was no mention of friendship, no talk of partnership, only the mechanical tone of duty fulfilled. The two men who had once toasted each other with vodka now communicated through translators and unsigned drafts. Behind the public smiles, both were haunted by what they had done, and what they had allowed. Churchill could not forget Poland, divided and silenced. Stalin could not forgive Britain's hesitation in opening the Second Front. Each saw the other as both ally and adversary. Necessary once, dangerous now. In the British archives, one note from Churchill's secretary still survives. It records the Prime Minister staring at a photograph of himself and Stalin from the Tehran conference. "Take it away," he said quietly. "I cannot look at it." The image, once a symbol of unity, had become a reminder of the cost of victory and the birth of a new kind of war. For Stalin, Churchill's name faded quickly. In Kremlin meetings, he referred to him only as the imperialist. Yet in private, he kept a single framed photo from 1943, Churchill, Roosevelt, and himself, standing shoulder to shoulder. When asked why he kept it, Stalin replied, "Because that was when we were honest. We all needed something from each other." The photograph they never took would have shown two victors, not enemies, two men bound by the impossible choices of survival. But perhaps no camera could have captured what truly lay between them: exhaustion, fear, and the quiet recognition that they had both changed the world and broken it. History often remembers alliances by their victories, not their silences. But between Churchill and Stalin, silence spoke louder than speeches. They never fought each other, yet neither ever trusted the other again. Their secret pacts redrew maps, erased nations, and built the fragile order we still live under. The end, they were not friends, not enemies, but reflections. Two men who looked across a table and saw in the other's eyes the cost of power. And when the war was over, both understood the same bitter truth. Peace had not united them. It had simply replaced one battlefield with another.